What's up, Frog Fanatics? Hope you're all having a fantastic afternoon. If you're here, then hopefully that means you want to come take a listen to what I would consider the most comprehensive matchup guide for Dimir Oculus versus Boros Energy that you will find anywhere on the internet today. Now, I do have to put just a string of asterisks here before we get started. First off, if you want to jump into the comments and say, oh, Dimir's dead, it did horrible at Prague and Ottawa, that's fine, but you're probably not going to want to keep watching the video. This is for the people that have decided they're running Dimir at their next RC, and they want all the help they can possibly get to try to flip the Boros matchup as much as possible. And hopefully I can provide some good insight, some good information to help you get there. This is also not a deck building guide. This is all assuming that you've already locked in your 75. Maybe there's a few slots here and there you're unsure of. We will have some card considerations when we get to the sideboarding portion. Everything down below will be time-stamped in case you do want to jump straight to that. But what I'm going to aim to do is go over the matchup and give every single bit of information I possibly can. We're going to go over what to look for when seeing your opponent's deck list for the first time, since a lot of the RCs are open deck list events. We're going to go over mulligan decisions on the play and the draw. We're going to go over early game play patterns on the play and the draw. Going to go over priorities you should look for, how you should use your resources. We're going to go over what lands to get when. We'll go over sideboarding. That's where we're going to get a lot more into individual card choices. Go over things that are better or worse in the matchup, non-traditional cards that might help you out if you're looking for a little bit of extra tech. We're going to go over the exact same scenarios in sideboarding games, mulligan decisions, play versus draw, common play patterns that are going to show up, what Boros is likely to be bringing in against you, and how to interact with that. So hopefully by the end of this, you've got a pretty ideal grasp on how to approach the matchup. Now, I will never at any point in the video claim that this is the best guide or that this is guaranteed to increase your win percentage by a certain point or anything like that. I just believe that I've had a decent amount of success in the matchup. I've had over a 60% win rate across leagues and challenges and track data since the unban announcements. And this is over like 50, 60 matches. So I feel like I've got some amount of insight to contribute, and hopefully that'll help you kind of think about things a little bit differently. If you've been struggling with the matchup, maybe we introduce you to a couple lines that you hadn't thought about before, and that switch can kind of flip and help you pick up some wins here and there. So as always, if you are enjoying the content, enjoying the commentary, feel free to leave a like, maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. Doesn't cost you anything, but lets you know when a new video is coming live. We are going to be doing a series of this kind of deep dive video over the next 4 or 5 days for some of the most popular matchups in Modern for Dimir. All going to be from the Dimir side. So if you're like a Yawgmoth player, sorry, I can't help you. Haven't played it. But for Dimir, hopefully we can get you across the finish line. So stay tuned. We'll go ahead and hop into the game one information and get the ball rolling. All right, so right off the bat, I do want to preface this by saying that this guide is mostly going to be useful for players who are entering Dimir Oculus into one of the RCs coming up. I know we already missed Prague and Ottawa. I wish we could have done the videos before that. Wasn't on my mind. Didn't think it was something I had any interest in doing. But I think that the deck did underperform in some of those RCs, and I want to address some of the reasons that I think that might have been the case. So we will be taking things like open deck lists into consideration. If you are wanting to play more in the online meta challenges, preliminaries, leagues, then this guide is going to have a lot of useful information to you. But sections like this upcoming one talking about first impressions on a deck list, you might want to skip past because you're not going to have this information in an online meta unless you're just like Googling your opponent every round. But first things first, you started a round, you see your pairing, you realize you're up against Boros energy. What are some of the first things to look for? So I just picked a couple lists from the top 8 of Prague. So basically random, could be anything. And we're going to go through some of the considerations that I would look for if I was in this match and this was my opponent. So, from the creature perspective, first off, I noticed that there's things like the standard core energy package, the 4 Ocelot Pride, 4 Guide of Souls, 4 Johnny, 4 Flage. They've flexed for 3 copies of Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. There are no copies of Seasoned Pyromancer. That's actually a really big thing to be aware of because it means my Stern Scoldings, if I have them main or sideboard, are now almost explicitly devoted to a Johnny. In some amount of the cases, they're going to go after Ocelot Pride's Ragavans, but a Johnny becomes target number 1. If I have Seasoned Pyromancers in my opponent's list, I'm starting to look more for using spell snares for a Johnny, save the Stern Scoldings for Seasoned Pyromancers, just to try to make sure I don't get caught with the wrong counter in hand at the wrong time. Obviously, you have to take into account if something like Goblin Bombardment is on your radar, or if it even does enough to really wreck you in that spot. If you are on one of the 4 counterspell builds, then looking at a list like this, you do have to take note of the fact that you don't have a way to counter Flage on the way back down. You might have Subtlety. I don't really recommend the card in current Modern, but who knows? You could decide that's where you want to go. But like Stern Scolding, Spell Snare, Force Negation, all miss Flage. They also all miss Fable except for Force Negation. So in a list like this with 4 Fable, 3 Goblin Bombardment, 3 Static Prison, and 2 Showdown of the Scalds, there's a really good chance that my Force Negations are going to be live late into the game. So just because something comes up early doesn't mean I want to ditch extra forces. If I can maybe choose to ditch something else to a force early and save a second force for a later Fable or Showdown, I want to think about that. There's no flex creatures like Thalia in this list. We'll see some others kind of floating around like this one that do have Seasoned Pyromancer. They have Thalia. Choosing to go a little more creature heavy, a little less permanent heavy. So keep an eye out for that. Another big consideration here is 0 copies of Blood Moon in the 75 for my opponent. So I can be a little more aggressive about fetching up Surveil lands, even just fetching up a tapped shock land early. That way, if I get to a point later where I need the extra mana and I need it untapped, I can still fetch up my basics and not lose that extra life. But being able to get the Surveils free and clear whenever you want them without worrying about getting Blood Mooned out is a pretty nice thing to be aware of. 3 copies of Static Prison means that percentage-wise, if my opponent does have an early Static Prison for like a Frog, they're a little less likely to have a second one or a third one. Also, 0 copies of Lightning Bolt. So I know that if I do get low and I need to stabilize, Flage is the only thing that's just going to like surprise kill me out of nowhere. I don't have to worry about Lightning Bolt. Obviously, Goblin Bombardment can, but it's a little less of a consideration because it still requires a board presence to be problematic. And hopefully you're not allowing your opponent to keep a very substantial board presence. The only other things I would really look at list-wise, things like Chained to the Rocks here instead of Static Prison. They do have some Static Prisons, but also have some Chained to the Rocks. So that might be a card that's a little higher priority to interact with than Static Prison, just because with Prison, you're going to get your threat back eventually if you're able to keep the energy under control. But with Chain to the Rocks, unless they strap it onto a Sacred Foundry and you have um, a Harbinger in your main deck, you're probably not getting that threat back. And keep in mind that you're looking at your opponent's list. They're also looking at yours. Things like Harbinger of the Seas are going to be a lot less surprising in game one. Your opponent's going to have a much better ability to play around it. So just don't get caught thinking that like a hand with a Harbinger in it is some lights out card against energy. Whereas you'd have a little bit better of an ability to surprise your opponent in an online meta. So that's about it for main deck considerations. Let's hop into the Mulligan decisions. So I was really wondering how I wanted to approach the Mulligan decision aspect of this video. I know that Magic Online has a feature that lets you view sample hands of the deck that you have selected. And I thought for a second that that would be kind of cool. But at the end of the day, if you're not running a 75 or a main deck 60 that's fairly similarly constructed, then I don't think just saying keep or mull on a bunch of random hands is really going to be that useful to you. So I'd rather talk about the theoretical approach to Mulligan decisions based on how games are likely to play out. So ideally, if you're on the play game one, and we'll go over Mulligan decisions on the draw as well, because you never know, 50-50 shot in the blind. If you're on the play, you're looking for a hand typically that has some way to push the advantage. So a turn 2 Frog, enough cards to fill up your graveyard for a turn 3 Oculus with an Oculus already in hand. What I don't like seeing is people keep hands that have like 3 fetch lands, a Thought Scour, a counter spell, Force Negation, something like that. And they can fill up their graveyard, but they don't really have any selection to help find a threat. You're just hoping you mill one over and find an unearth, or you draw into that threat. Being on the play especially means you're kind of the player with the foot on the gas. It's your job to get the game over with before you start having to worry about escape flages and too much interaction on your opponent's side. Make their mana costs a little more awkward by being the first person to take action. So things like playing out a Psychic Frog on turn 2, forcing your opponent to have the Static Prison right then and there can be a big deal. If you're able to keep a hand with a Psychic Frog and a Force Negation plus a blue card, you can run away with games with a turn 2 Frog, force a Static Prison, and just start snowballing from there. When you're on the play game one, you're not as worried about keeping a hand with 1 mana interaction. Things like Ragavan can be stonewalled by a turn 2 Psychic Frog, assuming you can protect it. But cards like Long Goodbye and Shoot the Sheriff, not for Ragavan specifically, since Ragavan is one of the like 3 outlaws in all of Modern you actually care about. But cards like Long Goodbye or Bitter Triumph, stuff like that, are castable on turn 2 into that turn 1 Ragavan, so you don't have to be as pressured into keeping a hand with 1 mana interaction. Cards like Spell Snare are surprisingly good on the play because it allows you to use your mana while also cantripping. So, for example, everybody talks about the power of Spell Snare on the draw being, oh, my 1 mana trades for a 2 mana spell. But Spell Snare on the play allows you to double up spells as early as turn 2 by potentially fatal pushing their 1-drop and spell snaring the follow-up, a Johnny or Goblin Bombardment, something like that. So I am usually happy to see Spell Snare on the play as well. Bloodchief's Thirst, a little more awkward since you can't actually use it to interact with something until turn 2. But again, that could be an opportunity where the Bloodchief's Thirst and a Spell Snare in the opener are able to kind of complement each other by making sure you're not falling behind in those first couple of turns. But the goal for any opening hand on the play should be to get a threat in play turn 2 or turn 3. Now, there's no guarantee that that threat's going to survive, but forcing the issue and not trying to be too reactive, especially if your build is cutting on things like counter spells, puts you in a much better position to steal that game one. I think that a lot of the current builds cutting counter spells are fine, but you have to lean into that with your mulligan decisions. You can't keep a reactive hand without the best reactive card that you have access to. Um, Unearth, perfectly fine on the play when combined with something like Thought Scour and a Frog. You don't really want to see hands that have Unearth and Oculus in hand unless they also have a Frog. The odds of drawing into a Psychic Frog in the first draw or two are fairly low, so you don't want to be very forceful about keeping a hand just because it's got Unearth and Oculus and could go off if you find the Frog, because the odds of that happening are fairly low. Thoughtseize on the play is really nice, but I wouldn't keep Thoughtseize as like the lone piece of interaction. It needs to have a follow up to it. Thoughtseize will take one of the early aggressive plays, but more than likely you're still going to have another Ragavan, a Johnny guide, something that is there to follow up that Thoughtseize with. So don't think you can just go Thoughtseize into cantrip, and be fine. But Thoughtseize to take away something like a static prison to clear the way for a frog is a very, very, very good way to pull ahead early. So don't think that it's a card that is bad in the matchup, especially on the play. It is absolutely a card that can clear the way and help out tremendously. On the draw, sideboarding is, or on the draw, mulligan decisions are quite a bit different. Spell Snare, Stern Scolding do get a lot better for being able to interact with like a turn 2 a Johnny, or if they have a turn 1 Ocelot or turn 1 Guide of Souls, then a turn 2 Ocelot Pride getting hit with like a Stern Scolding is really nice. Fatal Push, however, is your best card on the draw, hands down, 1000%. Being able to interact with a Ragavan on one, kill a guide in response to an Ocelot Pride, kill an Ocelot Pride on turn 1. There is a chance your opponent has to follow up a Johnny, but just stopping the snowball as early as possible is very, very significant. Almost to the point where I would say if you're on the draw game 1 against Boros, I would likely throw back any 7 that doesn't have a fatal push or Blood Chief's Thirst. I just don't think there's a very high likelihood that you're going to be able to catch up if your opponent goes something like turn 1 Ragavan, hits you, and then is able to follow up with a 1-drop and a 2-drop or something to that effect. Or if they've got a turn 1 guide and turn 2 second guide, Ocelot Pride, and you can't interact with anything in that first 2-turn cycle, you're just kind of dead in the water. So don't think that your hand of like Thought Scour, Counterspell, I don't know, Thoughtseize, Oculus, 3 lands is going to have much of a chance on the draw. Even a hand of like 2 lands, Spell Snare, Consider, Force, Frog has a very high chance of just not being good enough. Again, because that turn 1 play, if it's able to start snowballing, like a turn 1 Ocelot, turn 2, hit you, worst case scenario, play another Ocelot. Best case scenario, play like a Goblin Bombardment. You're still behind. You're still looking at like turn 3, Flage, play it, sack it to the Bombardment, 4-ball your Frog, make you discard, trigger the Ocelot. it's just not worth trying to keep a hand in the hopes that your Boros opponent is going slow enough to give you an opportunity to catch back up. Um, on the play, you have a little more chance of cheesing out with like a Thought Scour into an Oculus. On the draw, it gets a little bit worse because once you get to turn 3, 4, 5, you start having to take into account cards like Thraben Charm or Galvanic Discharge if they've had a Guide of Souls start. So don't try to, if you can afford to keep an opener that's not trying to high roll by getting lucky with a Thought Scour, then try not to do that. I know that's not always the case. You're not always available to keep the perfect 7, but just an idea of what to look for. On the play, be proactive, find threats. On the draw, Fatal Push is your best friend. Bloodchief's Thirst is acceptable, or something like Cut Down. Don't rely heavily on your counter spells on the draw. So that's it for mulligan decisions. Let's get into some of the play patterns that'll define how the match goes for you. Okay. Game 1 on the play. We've already gone over mulligans. You've got your opening 7. What are some of the early play patterns and considerations that you should be making to give yourself the best chance of pulling away in the mid game? On the play, first considerations are not falling behind, so not letting your opponent have an explosive start if you can prevent it. Not setting yourself up to get run over when you try to jam a threat is extremely important. Like we talked about in the mulligan decisions, being proactive on the play is a big deal. So keeping a hand that's able to land a frog on 2 and protect it, or land a frog on 3 with like a spell snare backup, land an Oculus with force, something like that is your priority for mulligan decisions. What we got to do with our early game interaction is get to a point where we're able to do that without just setting ourselves up for failure. So an example of what I mean here is cards like Fatal Push have a bit of a priority system. For example, if I've got a Fatal Push on turn 1 and my opponent plays a turn 1 Ragavan, I'm almost 100% Fatal Pushing that Ragavan on their end step. There's a couple considerations to be made there. If, say, I don't have a second land, I'd rather prioritize casting a cantrip to try to find one, or Surveil to try to find one. But ideally, I wouldn't keep a hand with one land. If I have a 2-drop that I care about or not, so if I'm planning on holding up a counter spell or a Psychic Frog on turn 2, I'm more likely to want to Fatal Push whatever goes on turn 1. If I don't have a follow-up 2-drop, then I might want to look at Surveiling on turn 1, holding up Fatal Push, and like Spell Snare on turn 2, something like that. But back to the priority situation, Ragavan and Ocelot Pride, kind of the highest tier. I don't want either of those cards to hit me if I can afford to avoid it. So Fatal Pushing those on my opponent's end step kind of takes the cake in terms of things I'm interested in doing on turn 1. If it's a Guide of Souls or something similar, some random card, I don't think they have any other 1-drops between or besides Guide, Pride, Ragavan, but who knows, Guide of Souls or something else, then there's a better chance that I'm ignoring it because I don't care about that card yet. I don't care about Guide of Souls until another card that Guide of Souls enables is put on the stack, or until some combo piece with Guide of Souls is there. So, for example, the Guide of Souls hitting me for 1 doesn't matter in the slightest. The Guide of Souls getting a trigger off of a turn 2 Ocelot Pride getting cast is a big deal. So my tier level for guide completely depends on whether or not something else is taking advantage of the pride or of the guide of souls in that moment. Now, that does get shifted if I've got something like Psychic Frog in hand or Counterspell that I want to hold up on too. That pushes the Guide of Souls priority up sheerly for mana efficiency. I want to play out my Psychic Frog on 2. So if that means Fatal Push the Guide on 1 so that I can play the Psychic Frog on 2 and not have to worry about my opponent having like double Ocelot Pride on their turn 2, then that's a big deal to help me kind of stabilize a bit. Hopefully they spend their turn trying to deal with the Psychic Frog, and I'm able to go to turn 3 with an open board, a Psychic Frog down, and an ability to start attacking and pull ahead on card advantage. Johnny is a card that obviously is nice to Stern Scolding or Spell Snare, but again, fairly low priority. A Johnny plus the cat don't really matter until something is going to flip the Ajani. So once you start dealing with Goblin Bombardments and Galvanic Discharge and Cat, then the priority level on the Ajani shifts. Again, like the Guide of Souls, the priority shifts naturally if you're looking for things like mana efficiency and setting up a play for the next turn. So, for example, if I've got a Fatal Push and, I don't know, Spell Snare, my opponent plays an Ajani, I want to get to hard casting an Oculus, then I might not care about the Ajani at the moment, but I might be more inclined to Fatal Push on their end step or in response to them making the cat token to try to set up hard casting an Oculus sooner, even if the Ajani itself as a threat is lower on my scale at that moment. Some important interactions to keep in mind in the first few turns are being able to interact with the Ajani with the trigger on the stack. I know that's base level for a lot of people, but I can't call this the most information-driven guide on the internet if I don't include everything that people should be aware of. So responding to Ajani making the cat allows you to kill the Ajani before your opponent has an opportunity to interact with their own cat and flip the Ajani to save it. So keep that in mind. Also, there's a lot of times where you want to attack into an Ajani or attack into your opponent and they have an Ajani to block, and you know they're going to put the cat in front of the Ajani or a cat in front of your attacker to try to flip the Ajani. Say, I've got a turn 2 Psychic Frog, they play an Ajani, I go to my turn 3, I don't want to ditch a bunch of cards and exile and fly the frog, I want to just attack in. They put the cat in front of my Psychic Frog, I discard a card. I want to kill the cat, have the Ajani trigger go on the stack, and then kill the Ajani. What you don't want to do is attack in, let the Ajani block or the cat block, and Fatal Push before the trigger goes on the stack. The reason is more for creating good habits than it is for, oh, I know my opponent's deck list, they can't have gut shot here, anything like that. Just get in the habit of doing it right when it doesn't matter, so that when it does matter, you won't mess up. If you run into some Boros deck down the road that does have gut shots, you'll know, hey, I want to let the Ajani trigger go on the stack. I want to kill the cat first, let the trigger go on the stack, and then kill it. So your opponent doesn't go, oh, response, gut shot my cat, flip it, flip the Ajani. So create good habits when you have the opportunity to. Galvanic Discharge is a bit of an interesting one when it comes to Frog. I think that's an interaction that a lot of people are very scared of is, oh, if my opponent leads, if I lead on Frog on 2, my opponent leads on Galvanic Discharge on their turn 2, what do I do? Do I just throw away cards? What if they have a Static Prison to follow up? What's my game plan there? And it's very contextual. So, for example, if I've got a Frog out, my opponent leads on to Galvanic Discharge, I'm assuming they have no energy available. I don't think really any energy lists are running Aether Hub nowadays. And I don't think there's any way for them to get an energy on turn one with their turn one play unless they just play a static prison for no value whatsoever, in which case I really hope you win that particular game. But assuming no way for them to make energy on turn one, galvanic discharge into your frog on their turn two, what are you doing? Again, contextual. What does the rest of your hand look like? Do you have a play that cares about growing the frog? So if I can discharge and if I can discard an Oculus for free and like another card to save the frog and set up an unearth, then obviously that's a slam dunk win-win for me. I've progressed my game plan. I've stifled their kill spell on my frog. I've put myself in a very advantageous situation to have a very powerful turn three. My opponent can't have Thraben Charm right now. I've kind of set myself up for success. Let's say I don't have Oculus and Unearth. What does the rest of my hand look like? Do I have 3 extra lands I'm not doing anything with? Then I'm pretty free to discard a couple of those. Do I have a hand of Force Negation, Counter Spell, Fatal Push, Consider, Second Frog, like a bunch of really strong cards? Well, then maybe I'm more inclined to let the first frog die and just play out a second frog the turn after. Or maybe I want to discard Force and a blue card because that's what I would be using on the spell anyway. Pump up my frog and let them decide if it's worth putting another spell into the frog or not. Static Prison definitely makes things a little bit dicier. If your opponent leads on a Static Prison, obviously you have the option to force a negation. You've got to do a little bit of odds calculation here. If they've got 1 Static Prison in hand, the likelihood of having a second Static Prison in hand is fairly low. It's a follow-up. So having a Force Negation blue card is a pretty enticing play to make. I would say more often than not, game 1, relying on a frog, I make them have the second Static Prison right then and there. If your opponent's playing one of these lists with like 4 Static Prison effects, I might be a little less likely. But if they're on 3, I'm probably forcing the issue and making them have the second answer and just planning on snowballing the frog. And when I say snowballing the frog, I mean like I've committed to this frog. I've put resources into this frog. I'm going to start throwing dead cards pretty aggressively into it and try to speed up the clock a good bit because I've determined that like this is my way of winning this game. If they do have the second Static Prison, you're down 2 cards to their 3, or you're down 3 cards to their 2. I put quotes there because you will get that Psychic Frog back in a couple turns if you're able to stop them from having an overload of energy in the meantime. So don't be too terrified of like, oh, they had second Static Prison, game's over, I can't win. No, you can still wait out that Static Prison, get your threat back. It's not the greatest feeling in the world, but having something is better than having nothing last time I checked. So you do have the possibility of regaining some of the board position. Other than that, if I play turn 2 frog and my opponent does something I can interact with, and then turn 3 I've got mana and my opponent hard casts a Flage, I am the happiest person in the entire universe, because if the best thing they can do is Flage 3-ball something, put that Flage in the yard, then I feel invincible at that point. Cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, a little more annoying. Seasoned Pyromancer, pretty annoying, because not only does it kind of force you to start eating your own yard to fly the frog and be able to get in damage, and draw cards, but it also creates a scenario where if your opponent just discards the Flage and gets it into the graveyard for free without having to spend mana on it, then that can start taxing some of your interaction, like your counter spells, your sink into stupors. Whereas if your opponent is spending mana, spending an entire turn to flage, then you can save a lot of that interaction and put yourself in a better position going forward because they're not actually impacting the board, and that's a very big deal. Goblin Bombardment, really good card, obviously. There's a lot of hands that don't care about Goblin Bombardment. Like, for a while there, it seemed like an auto, I have to counter this card, mostly when Amped Raptor was around and the possibility of just having an explosive turning to Goblin Bombardment was a much higher likelihood. Nowadays, you can have hands with like Spell Snare, Stern Scolding, Counter Spell that just don't care about the bombardment because your opponent's not going to resolve an explosive play to set up that bombardment. Spyro and Ocelot Pride are about the two best cards that bombardment has got nowadays. Being able to like sack your or play your Spyro, make a couple tokens, sack your Spyro, get it back from the yard, get more tokens, can deal some significant damage out of nowhere, or even like kill off an Oculus if you're not careful. But it's not as dangerous as Ocelot Pride going wide, a Johnny being able to flip immediately and ping on the cat trigger. What else? Thoughtseize priorities. Most opening sevens, if I have a Thoughtseize in my opening seven and I'm Thoughtseizing on turn one, it's really tempting to try to take some of the aggressive one drops. I would typically refrain from that if you've got the ability to interact with them through Fatal Push, Bloodchief's Thirst, Long Goodbye, Shoot the Sheriff, something like that. And I would focus more on cards like Fable of the Mirror Breakers, Static Prison, especially Static Prison, something that can interact profitably with your Frogs or Oculus and stop you from putting pressure. For the most part, if you've got like a Frog Snowball going or an Oculus, you can kind of close the game out faster than they can, assuming you're interacting a reasonable amount in the meantime. When I say a Frog Snowball, this is kind of an important line of events to keep in mind with Frog. There's going to be a lot of games that you have cards with Frog that are kind of dead. So I've got Frog out. It's turn 3. My opponent's got a card in hand. They haven't interacted with my Frog. This Thoughtseize is probably pretty dead. I don't really care about it. I'd rather use it to fuel my Frog. Now's when you need to start thinking about how can I snowball damage over the next several turns to get across the finish line sooner rather than later while still allowing me to interact in a significant manner. And the Frog Snowball here is kind of one of the best ways to do that. The way that the snowball kind of works in my mind is I've got a 1/2 Frog. I'm able to discard, say, 2 cards to the Frog, hit in for 3. Now you're at 17. Next, I've drawn an extra card for my Frog. Next turn, I'm going to throw another card into the Frog, hit you for 4. Now you're down to 13. Draw an extra card for the Frog. Turn after that, throwing 2 into the Frog, hit you for 6, down to 7. Draw an extra card. Next turn, throw 1 into the Frog, hit you for 7, you're dead. I can do that from starting on turn 3, have the game over with on turn 6. I've drawn 3 extra cards for the Frog and discarded a total of 6 out of the 7 cards that I've seen since I played the Frog, counting the 3 hits from Frog and the 4 draw steps that I've had. And I also have the ability to fly the Frog at least twice out of that 4-turn cycle. So if I'm able to get like that first hit in with a 3/4 Frog without having to fly it, now all of a sudden, like, that second discard is pretty free because I can throw away a card. I can fly the frog immediately, hit them. I know I'm going to be discarding 2 more the turn after. Things like that to not only put a lot more pressure on your opponent, but give your opponent less time to find a way out of situations is a really big deal. Now, obviously, the math can get thrown off by things like Flage, Escape Flage, but it gives you a baseline to work from to see, okay, how are these interactions for my opponent affecting this timeline? Is there anywhere that I can catch up? Is there anywhere that I fall too far behind? What can they have that really throws me off? If I get rid of one less card, can I still interact profitably? If I get rid of an extra card and speed it up a turn sooner, am I still able to fight the way I want to? Because we're still talking about discarding 6 cards, having seen 7, plus the cards in your opening hand. You're not throwing those away. This is all new cards that you're discarding and drawing. So out of that opening 7, do I have the ability to fight for a few turns? Because there might be a turn or 2 that just doesn't matter. And if you're able to ignore those, then the frog snowball works out pretty well. What else am I forgetting? Some of these lists are running cards like Showdown of the Skalds. Showdown of the Skalds, bunch of Fables. You probably don't have great answers for those main deck unless you're running counter spells. But Showdown, if you read it, doesn't do anything the very first turn it's played unless your opponent has just an insane amount of mana. Can snowball a little bit after that, but the first turn is really like a turn off. So I'm more inclined to use counter spells on Flages than I am Showdowns. But there's going to be some number of games where you can just close out the game because you have like double counter spell and they put a Showdown on the stack, and you might as well just not risk it because you don't want them flipping into like 2 pieces of interaction. So your counter spell priority really should be Flage is number 1. Flage escaping, not Flage on the front half. Flage on the front half, you're basically never interacting with in a million years. But Flage escaping, Seasoned Pyromancer, or Fable of the Mirror Breaker, if you think it's going to set up a Flage, or you can't deal very well if it does set up a Flage, or Static Prison. Everything else should be interacted with Spell Snares, Stern Scolding, Fatal Push. Yeah, I guess that's about it for that one. So let's get into sideboarding. Now, this is going to be where we start getting into a lot of the good stuff. This is, if I told you to skip forward earlier, this is where you should be hitting, where we're really going to be going through card choices, what's good, what's bad in the matchup, what I would recommend boarding in, boarding out, why I would board it in and out, how it's going to affect games. I don't know why my nose is itching so much, but past that. Sideboarding against Boros. So we can start. Let's pull up one of these Boros lists here. Start by looking at the Boros list and taking into account how they are likely going to be sideboarding against you. The big board ends are going to be stuff like Ghost Vacuum, in the case of this list, Soul Guide Lantern. Not really much past that. Maybe extra Showdown of the Skalds if they got those in the board. Any extra like value spell. But from the Boros side, there's not really a whole lot different they want to do post-board that they're not already doing pre-board. It's kind of up to the Dimir side to do a good job of answering what you've got coming at you. Sideboard outs could include things like some number of galvanic discharges because they might not be able to answer an Oculus or a Frog cleanly. If they're running something like Lightning Bolt, it can get cut pretty easy. You've got maybe an extra Goblin Bombardment gets trimmed. Felia could get trimmed. An extra Ragavan, especially if they're on the draw instead of the play. Stuff like that is what you're typically going to see. So from our side, we've got to respect that our opponent is going to be going a little heavier on the value plan. Again, I have to start by saying this is for an open deck list tournament. Keep that in mind with a lot of the recommendations that I'm going to make. For example, Harbinger of the Seas is one of the cards that's gotten a lot of free wins against Boros over the years, over the year or so since MH3. But it's not going to be the end-all be-all when your opponent knows about it. Most of these Boros lists are running like a couple copies of basic plains, a basic mountain, so it's pretty easy for them to fight off a Harbinger with Thraben Charm, Galvanic Discharge, Static Prison, even just getting like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker attacking or Ragavan attacking in can be enough to force the issue and like get the Harbinger off the board. So I do think Harbinger is pretty weak when it comes to sideboard options. Stern Scolding is like best card you have available to you because it lets you save a lot of your removal for emergency positions or do a better job of using your more general counters early to save your specific counters for specific threats. So being able to Stern Scolding and a Johnny early lets you save a Spell Snare for a Goblin Bombardment, which lets you save a Force Negation for a Fable or for a Showdown of the Scalds. So you see how it starts like a chain reaction kind of shifting a lot of your interaction to the correct spot in the matchup instead of trying to say, oh, well, my opponent had the Johnny on 2. I had to Spell Snare it because I don't have Stern Scoldings in my 75. And then they played a Fable on 3, and I had to force pitching a counter spell because I had to get a threat down. And then turn 4, they went for a Showdown, and I just had nothing. Stuff like that. So Stern Scolding's like easy board in. Nihil Spellbomb, I like having 1 or 2 just as answers to Flage. Typically, the hard cast on Flage, you don't really mind. The escape on Flage, you might have an answer to. But once they start getting to like escape Flage a second time or Flage with an Arena of Glory, it starts getting kind of dicey. So Spellbomb, just to help mitigate their ability to escape Flage at will, is a pretty nice deal. Engineered Explosives is fine. Toxic Deluge is fine. Sweeper effects are good if you can stop your opponent from getting like Guide of Souls counters going first. But if they start getting counters, get an attack, and then you follow up with a Deluge, you end up losing a lot of life that you didn't need to lose otherwise. I will say, in an open deck list event like this, with people being less likely to register Blood Moon, Glistening Deluge does get a little bit of a buff. I still don't personally like Glistening Deluge because if they put the counters on a Guide of Souls, then Deluge just misses that altogether. And I think if I'm going to put a sweeper in my sideboard, I want it to hit everything I want it to hit when I want it to hit it. I don't want a sweeper that's missing significant pieces. Engineered Explosives, being able to take out like Static Prisons, Chain to the Rock, stuff like that is really, really nice, along with Guide of Souls, Ocelot Prides, Ragavans, all kind of in one swoop, but it is a little more susceptible to things like Static Prison on the Engineered Explosives, because if they get rid of the prison, it comes back with 0 counters on it. Can't take out the 1-drops anymore. So you kind of have to wait till a turn that you can play out the EE and crack it, or be able to crack it in response to them playing a Static Prison. I don't think I mentioned it at the start of this video, but I am only talking about the Dimir build specifically here. If you're wanting to play Esper and run cards like Pest Control, that's completely reasonable, but I really want to focus on cards that everybody is going to have access to instead of specific cards for a certain color combination that not everybody's going to be running. Like Toxic Deluge, EE, even if you're running Pest Control, you have access to EE if you want to run it. Other sideboard cards that I think are extremely good in the matchup are Graveyard Trespasser, being able to snipe a Flage from the yard or just like keep the yard kind of contained, eventually be able to start attacking in and regaining a little bit of that life that you might have lost from an early aggressive start on their side or a Goblin Bombardment. Meat Hook Massacre is okay. I again like Glistening Deluge. Having a double black costed sweeper that might not hit everything is a consideration, but being able to effectively neutralize a Goblin Bombardment is a very non-zero thing to consider. So if you think Goblin Bombardment is a card that you really want to be able to interact profitably with, then that gives you a way to not lose to like Bombardment plus Ocelot Pride and a few tokens. You still have to deal with the Ocelot Pride to keep them from swinging wide against you, but it means you're not just dead to them sacking off a bunch of stuff. Is there anything else out of the board that I really recommend? Brazen Borrower is not too good. Subtlety. I know some people really like Subtlety against like Escape Flage. I think it's a little awkward because that's about the only time it's useful. I really don't want to go down 2 cards to effectively unsummon a Guide of Souls or an Ocelot Pride or something like that. Yeah, I don't think there's really anything else out of the board I would highly recommend. Out of the main deck, Force of Negation used to be a much heavier cut for me. It's gotten a little bit more use as of late, with Fable of the Mirror Breaker making a return, Showdown of the Scalds, Chain to the Rocks, stuff like that, seeing more play. If you look at your opponent's deck list and you see more Seasoned Pyromancers, I'm more likely to cut on the forces. If you see more Fable of the Mirror Breakers or you suspect them to be bringing in or leaving in Blood Moons, then keeping the force count up is usually the right call. But at the same time, you can just fetch around Blood Moon for the most part. So I wouldn't be too stressed about that one. Counterspell, on the draw, I'm more likely to cut some number of counterspells. On the play, I'm trying to keep a good number in because, kind of like I mentioned in game 1, getting out on the front foot with a Frog or an Oculus on the play is one of the best ways that you can steal games against Boros, and one of the best follow-ups you can have to a threat out on the front foot is a counter spell to deal with an Escape Flage or Seasoned Pyromancer, Blood Moon, just any generic thing that your opponent wants to resolve after. So it does lend itself really well to a curve. Thoughtseize is a card that I'm cutting a good bit of post-board. Just the life aggression is a real consideration, but also you're bringing in things like Stern Scolding and EE and Deluge, Nihil Spellbomb, so you don't need to answer things from hand as well. You're doing a better job of answering things on the stack or answering things after they've resolved. As far as the Oculus, Unearth, Thoughtscour package, typically when I'm looking at sideboarding, I'm viewing those 3 cards kind of as a cohesive unit, and I'm looking at trimming in one of 2 ways. If my opponent has got a bunch of all-inclusive grave hate, so things like Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace, cards that are just nuking the entire yard all the time, then I'm more likely to trim on the Oculus side, maybe the Unearth side after I finish trimming the number of Oculuses that I want. But against a Rest in Peace, like Oculus isn't going to do anything. and you run the risk of not being able to find a Sink into Stupor or an Otawara or something to be able to interact with that Rest in Peace. Obviously, you don't have to worry about Rest in Peace from Boros, but just as an idea, maybe you see a Boros player with Leyline, who knows. Against a lot of the one of grave reaction or grave hate pieces, and when I say one of, I mean like one card at a time. So things like Unlicensed Hearse, I know it's 2, but it's targeting a small amount of cards. Ghost Vacuum, Graveyard Trespasser, anything like that. I'm more likely to trim some copies of Unearth and leave the Oculus count high. Effectively, when they're worried about exiling one card at a time, it's actually very common that you're going to be able to overload that Grave Hate with Thought Scour, Surveil lands, actually interacting with what your opponent's doing. So hard casting an Oculus is a very real possibility and is often going to be the way that you fight through that Grave Hate. But Unearth becomes a lot more of a liability because of cards like Ghost Vacuum just shutting it down and not allowing you to resolve that spell in the first place. You can always say, oh, Unearth is able to be cycled if they do end up having a Ghost Vacuum. So I want to keep more Unearths than Oculus. But cycling an Unearth is so abysmally ineffective is not the right word. Inefficient. It's very inefficient to be taking off what is effectively a full turn just to replace an Unearth in your hand with another card. Yeah, it gets better the later the game goes on and you top deck an Unearth, but you run the risk at that point of if your opponent just has a Ghost Vacuum, they're probably getting close to being able to just pop it, in which case cycling the Unearth probably isn't helping you much. But hard casting Oculus through Ghost Vacuum, through Unlicensed Hearse, stuff like that is very possible. And it is a little bit better to cut the Unearths against some of the instant speed Grave Hate like Thraben Charm. So if you see your opponent on an extensive amount of those, then you could, honestly, I'd say like all Grave Hate, just about. I'd rather cut Unearth than Oculus if it's a one card at a time or a sacrifice this, nuke the yard effect. So like Nihil Spellbomb, Soul Guide Lantern, Thraben Charm are all that sack, exile the whole yard one time effect. And you can rebuild from that. Against the Leyline of the Void's Rest in Pieces, you can't rebuild when your graveyard's gone. So cutting Oculus is more in favor than cutting Unearth. But usually against a deck like Boros, if I'm looking at cutting 4 Thoughtseize, 2 Unearth, and like Force, that's about 7 cards coming out. So I can bring in Stern Scoldings, I can bring in EE, Toxic Deluge, some number of spell bombs, and then if I want a spell bomb, if I want a Miser Harbinger, if I've got a Graveyard Trespasser, that's usually about the 7 slots that I want to bring in. The rest of the main deck considerations, if you're running 4 Oculus and 2 Murktide Regent, plus the Unearth and the Thought Scour, I would be more inclined to leave in some number of, or leave in all the Force Negations, leave in some number of Thoughtseize, and trim on some number of the Graveyard Reliant threats. Yes, you can rebuild from the one-time Grave Hate that Boros usually puts you through, but if you've got 6 or 7 threats that rely on the graveyard instead of 4, it's a lot more likely that you're going to see multiples of those cards post-board. So even if they don't have a graveyard destroying effect or graveyard exiling effect, having a situation where your opponent just static prisons a hard cast Murktide or a hard cast Oculus can leave your graveyard kind of in tattered pieces, and you don't want to flood out on those threats after your opponent's able to effectively neuter that part of the game. Other sideboard considerations, if you've got things like Nihil Spellbomb in the main already, you're probably just not cutting them, even if you don't actively want to bring them in from the sideboard. Some lists are running Stern Scoldings in the main, really good. Consigned to Memory, I do think, is a bit of a stretch card. It was a little bit better when Boros was running not only like the full play set of Static Prisons, but set of the One Rings as well. Now, obviously, the One Ring's gone. Static Prison, you might see 3, some lists run 4, but that's about the only thing that you're aggressively caring about interacting with as far as triggered or activated abilities go. You can fight over a Fable making a dude, but they're still going to get to loot. You can fight over a Felia blinking stuff, but you still have to deal with the Felia. The Spyro enter, but you still have to deal with the Spyro. So it's just not a very effective use of resources. You end up spending a card to not deal with the full thing that your opponent's doing. So you spend a card to deal with half a card or some smaller portion of a card. Not a very great trade-off. Same thing, I think, with Brazen Borrower and Subtlety. If you're using them to bounce a card like a Guide of Souls or a Flage, Fable, whatever, you're still having to deal with that thing later. So you're just putting off to next turn what you still have to answer, and you're probably not going to be putting the clock forward to deal with your opponent in the meantime. Now, I will say there's been a lot of discussion. I got to do a self-plug here for the Control Freak Discord. If you're interested in coming over and reading up on some of the conversation, there's been a lot of conversation going on about Thoughtseize versus Counterspell in the main deck of these Dimir lists. And I do think Boros is kind of the prime example of where this discussion originated from and how it's got a little bit of divisiveness in the Dimir community. So originally there were players talking about cutting Counterspell because, especially on the draw in matchups like Boros, it can be very awkward if you see multiples, if your opponent's able to cast 2 or 3 spells before you're able to hold up Counterspell. And at that point, it's not effective at catching you up or really stopping that early onslaught. So you see people trading them in for extra copies of Spell Snare, Spell Pierce, Stern Scolding, things like that, or even Thoughtseize. And the idea there is Thoughtseize is going to be trading 1 for 1 as soon as turn 1, where Counterspell could be turn 3 if you're on the draw before you're able to actually utilize that spell. So there is a very good turn gap. Thoughtseize is really good for clearing the way for Frog in post-board games. So if you've identified that you think the way you're able to effectively approach the matchup is to clear the way for Frog, and so finding a hand with Thoughtseize into Frog or Thoughtseize into Interaction into Oculus is the way to go, then it's a respectable take. I do think Thoughtseize is a little bit weaker against Boros because a lot of their cards are very redundant. A lot of cards are cheap creatures that synergize very well with any of their other creatures. So, for example, if you take an Ocelot Pride and strand them with an Ajani and a Guide of Souls, then the Guide into Ajani line is still very synergistic, very good at pulling them ahead. If you take the Ajani, then Ocelot Pride after a Guide of Souls, start triggering the Pride and going wide there. If you take the Guide of Souls, then Ocelot Pride into Ajani gives you extra cats that you can't deal with without risking the Ajani flipping. Obviously, taking Flage is a nightmare. Spyro and Fable. Really, it's just clearing a static prison for a Frog is about the best you're going to get from a Thoughtseize post board. Counterspell, I do think, has a little more utility because it does actually give you an answer to an escape Flage where you might not have had one otherwise, outside of Sink into Stupor or hopefully hitting one on the escape. it's a little bit better with cards like Seasoned Pyromancer, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, the Static Prison Chain to the Rocks effects, just having an answer to those consistently, even if it is a little bit slower. You might have to lean more in Force Negation if you don't have Counterspell. Again, Fable, Showdown of the Scalds, Chain to the Rocks, all that stuff. Force can answer, but you put a little bit more pressure on having your interaction line up the way that you need it to, whereas Counterspell is a little bit more of a slower catch-all. Anything else about the sideboarding side or the good or bad cards? If you're on Graveyard Trespasser in the main, that's staying. If you're on Harbinger of the Seas, especially post board on the draw, I'm cutting all my Harbingers on the draw against Boros specifically 100% of the time. On the play, I might bring in a board or bring in a Harbinger just for the chance of maybe cheesing out my opponent if I can get a turn 3 Harbinger down and they don't have a chance to get both their basic plains and mountain. It's not a huge probability, but sometimes it can be okay for just shutting down Escape Flage later or stopping Arena of Glory. But it's not a reliable game plan. And especially if you're on the draw, your opponent can play around it with their fetching very easily and very consistently. I think that's about it. So let's go talk about some of the post board early game sequencing. Just a quick disclaimer before we get on to the next section. I do realize a couple cards that I missed when going over the sideboarding options. The first one being Tamiyo Inquisitive Student. If you're running Tamiyo in the main, I would highly recommend cutting it post board against Boros. It's a very inefficient blocker when anything with Guide of Souls triggers or Guide of Souls counters can attack into it freely. And then you're running the risk of your opponent doing something like dashing back a Ragavan. If you attack in with it instead of holding back to block, it dies to Galvanic Discharge. It dies to Lightning Bolt. 2 creatures, and it dies to a Thraben Charm. Just kind of like noodle status out there. The ultimate is very good, or the flip tick up is very good against Ocelot Pride. The ultimate is very good against everybody, but I don't believe it's worth the risk of having a low impact attacker when you need to be focusing on interaction. In the sideboard, I missed the surgical extractions. Surgical extraction is a really good answer for Flage if you believe that that's the card you're losing to and you want an additional answer to it specifically. I would also consider surgical extraction on things like Seasoned Pyromancer, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Goblin Bombardment to a lesser extent, Ocelot Pride, if you think that you don't have enough, say, sweepers or counter magic for some of those, and they can create some problems down the road. But also only if your opponent's running like a bunch of them. If they're running 2 Seasoned Pyromancer and you counter one, I probably wouldn't worry about surgicaling it just to try to stop the second one. But if your opponent's on like 4 Fable of the Mirror Breaker and you counter the first one, that or Thoughtseize, that could be a very good target to cut out a lot of their value-oriented gameplay in game 2. So thankfully, the post board sequencing against Boros is very, very similar in a lot of spots to pregame. If you're on the draw, a lot of the Mulligan decisions are almost identical. On the draw, really looking for fatal pushes to interact with a Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, Ragavan, looking for counter spells as a follow-up, spell snare, stern scolding, and then trying to get into a spot where you can resolve an Oculus. Psychic Frog, really good to match up, but I do think Oculus is like a tier above if it can resolve, mostly because it's a a significantly sized threat that you don't have to invest more cards into right away, and gives you a form of pseudo card advantage by creating more bodies that can stand in the way of Ragavans, Spyro tokens, Johnny tokens, Ocelot Prides, any of that stuff. And there's always the chance you just flip over like another Oculus and kind of win the game on the spot. That's like our version of Splinter Twin is Oculus flip over another Oculus. Um, really, the only decisions that come into play that are any different when it comes to sideboarding or the Mulligan decisions on sideboarding is how stern scolding fits into the mix. Uh, I wouldn't be looking aggressively for a hand that has like Nihil Spellbomb. I wouldn't even be looking aggressively for a sweeper over a copy of Fatal Push, Blood Chief's Thirst, Long Goodbye, Shoot the Sheriff, something like that. The normal interaction that we have is good enough for slowing the game down. I would be looking for a way to interact with a 3-drop on their side. So on the draw, something like a counter spell to fight over a Seasoned Pyromancer or a Fable of the Mirror Breaker Blood Moon, or on the play, something to get out ahead of a 3-drop like Psychic Frog on the battlefield, Oculus. That way, you're not as impacted by their 3-drops as you would be if they were hitting on an open board. On the draw, more likely to progress the game reactively. Wait until turn 3 or 4 when I can play out a frog and still have a way to interact. What you don't want to do is get into a situation where you play out your frog on 2, they untap on 3, answer the frog with, say, a Static Prison, and play in a Johnny. That's when you start snowballing your, I don't want to say misfortunes because you kind of set yourself up for it if that happens. But that's where the problems really get created with Boros. It's really good at taking advantage of those little mishaps by putting a lot of pressure into play really, really quickly. So on the play, more trying to prevent that snowball. On the play, more likely to be aggressive and force my opponent to interact so that they can't snowball. On the draw, more likely to not make that play in the first place to prevent giving my opponent the opportunity to make the snowball. The hands you really have trouble with that you got to think about post board, pretty similar to pre-board. The like guide ocelot plays or something like that, where your interaction can be a little bit awkward. So a good example is I've had a number of games that started off really dicey because my opponent played a turn 1 guide. I let it hit me. Turn 2, they played a second guide, and I've got a stern scolding. And I have to decide, okay, do I want to stern scolding this guide to try to stop some of the energy production, or do I want to let it go in case they have an Ocelot Pride? Because if they have a Pride and they can start going wide, then that puts a lot more pressure on me finding one of my sweepers, which is a lower percent chance to me just finding like another spot removal spell for a guide. So I would lean more towards saving the counter for an opener like that. If they lead on a Johnny, you're countering it all day. But if they lead on second guide, I'm probably not interacting and making them show me the pride and choosing to fatal push the pride if you have the option instead of going for stern scolding on it, so you can save that stern scolding for an Ajani or a Seasoned Pyromancer, one of the 2-for-1s down the road. This can also be applied if you have the card Fatal Push. If your opponent goes for guide, next turn casts another guide, you might be tempted to Fatal Push the first guide to prevent some extra life gain, energy gain. The life gain honestly doesn't matter that much in the long run. I would be more concerned about keeping an Ocelot Pride off the board than worrying too much about that one extra life and energy. And if you wait, you can always Fatal Push into turn if they don't have the Ocelot Pride. But if they do, you want to be able to kill it before they go to their end step, which is another big note. You've got to kill the Ocelot Pride second main if you don't want them to get the extra cat token. But there are plenty of times that you don't care because if you go for the fatal push in a turn, your opponent might not want to overcommit into a wrath effect if they know you have cards like Toxic Deluge. If you go to fatal push the guide or the pride on their second main phase when they have mana available, there's always a chance that they can just say, okay, still on second main, play another Ocelot Pride, make another token. So a decent number of times you want to just go to instep, let them make the token, fatal push the Ocelot Pride, and untap, just staring down a Guide to Souls and a 1/1 cat, and say, okay, I'm not going to lose to this 1/1 cat. I'm going to find something to stand in front of it. But I prevent them from playing the Ocelot Pride or backup Ocelot Pride right there. Not always a perfect plan, but sometimes your hand just kind of works out in a way that it makes more sense to let your opponent have the token, especially if you have like an Oculus and you're going to be clogging up the ground pretty quickly anyway. There's not a ton of lines where you want to push the envelope on your own turn against Boros. For example, if your opponent's got open mana and you're thinking, I've got this unearthed, my opponent doesn't have a piece of Grave Hate sitting out yet, I might want to main phase go for the Thought Scour, try to flip over an Oculus to go for the unearth. If your opponent has got a Surgical Extraction or a Thraben Charm, then they can just blow you out by making you kind of waste more mana on your own turn before they're able to resolve something. So if you have the chance to use your interaction or hold up your interaction, use your cantrips on your opponent's instep. It's really a lot better post board against them than trying to pull off the lucky top deck flip. What else? Mention the priorities for most everything in the pre-board. Like I said, post-board doesn't change a whole lot against boards. Orcish Bowmasters. Definitely a card that is better on the play than the draw. I think it's pretty overrated in the matchup altogether, even before the One Ring left. But the only thing that Orcish Bowmasters is effectively trading with or effectively dealing with is a Guide of Souls on the play. If you're on the play and your opponent has a turn one Guide of Souls, and even then you run the risk of them having a turn two, like a Johnny, where they can attack in a little bit more freely, or a turn two Goblin Bombardment, and all you really did was take out an Ocelot Pride. So if you have Bowmasters in the main, I would highly be considering cutting them unless your opponent's on like 4-season Pyromancer, and then it looks a little bit better if you're able to flash one in response to a Spyro and maybe take out some other problematic creature that you need to deal with. Because with getting 3 triggers, now you're getting into the territory of like taking out Guide of Souls and an Ocelot Pride, or taking out an Ajani and the token with just your Bowmaster, while still keeping a body that's bigger than the Spyro itself. Yeah, so let's move on to some of the kind of advanced interactions. I think this will be a good spot for a lot of people to hear some things they might not have thought about in the matchup that could potentially save you a game or two. So I want to get into a few matchup specific interactions for Dimir versus Boros that you might not have heard before. And I do think these are very good and useful to know, because every one of them has come up with me at least once, usually multiple times, and they have resulted directly in either winning or losing an individual game. So I think this is a good time that if you're wondering about some of the niche interactions that can swing things, this is probably the tune in opportunity, and put your listening cap on and get ready. First off, Guide of Souls. Guide of Souls results in 2 triggers when you choose to put the counters on something. So Guide of Souls attacks, or a creature attacks. Guide of Souls creates a trigger. This trigger says, hey, do you want to pay 3 energy in the first place? Do you want to put counters on something somewhere? And you say yes to that. Then another trigger goes on the stack that says, okay, where would you like to target to put the counters? So you don't have to respond to the Guide of Souls attack trigger. Your opponent does have to indicate, they have to spend the energy first and then indicate where they're putting the counters, and then you can respond to the counters being placed after the energy has been spent. So don't get in, or don't let your opponent try to shortcut it if you have interaction, say like attack with guide, response, kill this. Oh, well, I'm going to put the counters over here. No, they got to indicate before the ability can actually resolve. It doesn't matter so much for us since we're a black removal based deck, so Fatal Push doesn't really care how big a lot of stuff gets, but it can be good for things like Glistening Deluge out of the board to be able to pick off a Guide of Souls if they want to target itself, and then be able to Glistening Deluge to wipe out the board afterwards, or to make like Toxic Deluge a little more manageable if you're playing it. Maybe you don't want to put an extra counter on Psychic Frog to fly in for an attack. Anything like that can be very relevant. Ocelot Pride, it triggers when the 10th token comes into play. So there's one trigger that resolves, but it resolves in multiple parts. I didn't realize this for a while after playing against Ocelot Pride, that on your end step, if it's making a token, it makes the token 100% of the time. A token is made if you gained life. And then it checks if you've got the city's blessing. And if you do, after that token is made, then it proceeds to make copies of any tokens that entered this turn. So I had originally thought that Ocelot Pride triggered at the end step and it made a token. And if you had 10 things already when that token entered, then you would make additional copies. But that token can be the 10th thing and you will get the additional copies. So be careful on your counts for things like Ocelot Pride, a Johnny, or Goblin Bombardment, something like that, entering that turn. Because you might be thinking, oh, my opponent makes one token into turn and I go to mine, but in reality, they end up making like 2 1/1 cats, an extra 2/1 cat, an extra Goblin Shaman, because you thought that the Ocelot Pride wouldn't trigger when it actually does. And then you better have a sweeper effect where you're kind of donezo at that point. Next one, a Johnny Nicodle Pariah. Another kind of weird trigger situation with it. So the cat token that it makes, or any of the other cats on the battlefield, if they are bounced with a card like Sink into Stupor, Odawara, Brazen Barber, that does not trigger the Ajani to flip. I think I've seen people get a little confused with the cat token, thinking like, oh, it gets bounced, it ceases to exist, it dies, that should flip the Ajani. It does not. So anything that says like kill it, destroy it, or dealing lethal combat damage, lethal red damage, that stuff triggers the Ajani. Bouncing the token and making it vanish from existence does not flip the Ajani. Now, when the Ajani does get to flip, the 0 ability creates a reflexive trigger, I believe is the right word for it, where they make the cat enters, and then the trigger goes on the stack to deal damage equal to the number of creatures. So if they make the cat resolves. The trigger goes on the stack to deal damage. You kill a cat after the trigger goes on the stack. It'll deal 1 less damage. Usually once you get to flip to Johnny's status and they're making tokens, you kind of assume they've got like a goblin bombardment, and it's not looking great for you to regardless, but it can be useful for things like Plague Engineer out. If you have Plague Engineer in your board for whatever reason, you can effectively neuter or cut out into Johnny, because they'll make the token dies like before the trigger is put on the stack, and it's going to say, oh, there's less creatures on the battlefield. What's next? Flage. With Flage, the only real interesting interaction occurs when you get to a higher CM or higher amount of mana on both sides. So you're talking about like top decking Flage with 7 lands or something like that. And there's a really nice little interaction you can use. So if your opponent casts a Flage and you've got a way to deal with the Flage, say, or when it's in the graveyard, say Nihil Spellbomb, Surgical Extraction, something like that, and they put the Flage on the stack, you run the risk of, if they stack their triggers correctly, then they can deal the 3 and then sack the Flage, and then you don't get a priority opportunity to crack the Flage or to exile the Flage with the rest of the graveyard. So you have to run the risk of exiling everything but the Flage, but then they get to keep the Flage around. You risk it escaping later. A fun little interaction you can use is 2 options. One, if you have a counter spell, you can crack the spell bomb, like Flage is on the stack, crack the spell bomb, counter spell the Flage. The Flage goes to the graveyard. The spell bomb activation is still on the stack. They don't have a priority opportunity with an empty stack to cast the Flage from the graveyard. Spell bomb resolves, exiles the rest of the graveyard. If you try to wait until after you counterspell, they get priority back. They can just immediately escape the Flage, and the plan doesn't work. The same thing can be used with removal spells by allowing the Flage to hit the battlefield, and then you crack your spell bomb in response to the Flage sack trigger. With the Nihil Spellbomb sack on the stack, Fatal Push, because you now have Revolt from the Spellbomb leaving, or Shoot the Sheriff, Long Goodbye, whatever your choice is, to kill the Flage. It'll resolve its 3 damage trigger, but the Nihil Spellbomb will resolve before they get an opportunity to cast the Flage from the graveyard. So it's a nice little interaction to just stop you from dying to like Flage, immediately escape Flage, while still being able to exile the Flage and not have to worry about them escaping it again in the near future. What else? We know about Discharge. Don't have to pay till it resolves. Raven Charm, the damage dealing off the Raven Charm doesn't check until the spell resolves, so you can respond to it with picking off a creature or 2 and reduce the damage. It's useful if they've got like 3 creatures and they're trying to kill off an abhorrent Oculus. Static Prison, nothing real crazy with it. Goblin Bombardment, nothing real crazy there. Blood Moon, Fable. If you really wanted to bring Consign in against Boros, then you can Fable some of the what are they called? Saga chapter triggers from Fable of the Mirror Breaker. So like the first one to stop them from making a Shaman token can be nice if you've got a Harbinger of the Seas out. The discard 2, draw 2 is nice if you think they're going to be able to just pitch a Flage and get it back for free. Because that is one of the ways that they can escape a Flage without giving a priority opportunity. And then the chapter 3 that actually lets them get the reflection of the Kiki Jiki you can stifle that trigger, and they'll just sack the Fable and don't get a reflection. It's a lot like Urza's Saga and picking and choosing what chapter you're interacting with based on the board state. But it's good to at least know the outcome of some of those options. Stuff they're boarding in against you. Wrath of the Skies. I've had a non-zero number of energy players bring in Wrath of the Skies, which isn't crazy, but they'll go to pay for the spell. They'll have 5-6 energy sitting around, pay 2 for Wrath of the Skies to try to like pay 5 energy and exile the important Oculus and whatnot. And you can spell snare a Wrath of the Skies if they pay 2 mana for it, regardless of how much energy they're wanting to pay. They don't pay the energy until it resolves. It doesn't add to the X on the cost in any way. So if they physically tap more mana to gain more energy when they Wrath the Skies, you cannot spell snare it at that point. But if they don't pay to get any extra energy, you can spell snare it, which happens a reasonable amount of the time because they usually don't care as much about the energy as they do about being able to double spell. So sometimes you can catch them like turn 4, turn 5, trying to go Wrath into Flage or something, and you're able to stop the Wrath, and then the Flage just like doesn't really matter. Ghost Vacuum. You can exile stuff with your own frog in response to a Ghost Vacuum if you don't want them getting back Oculus or something later. Honestly, I haven't found Ghost Vacuum to be that threatening in the mirror between you exiling your own things to fly frog and them having static prisons or chained to the rocks, things like that. Most creatures end up getting exiled anyway, or you can always use them to get a little bit of extra life drain with a Graveyard Trespasser. So really haven't found Ghost Vacuum to be that impactful. Just double checking some of these Boros lists to see if any cards are really jumping out that are out of the normal. Minor Misstep is a card that I've tried a couple times in Dimir and just didn't end up drawing it. Theoretically pretty good against Boros, being able to fight over Static Prison, Chain to the Rocks, Ghost Vacuum, Ocelot, Guide, Ragavan, Discharge. Pretty good amount of stuff on their side. So if you're wanting an extra card to maybe test out specifically for that matchup, that could be an option for you. Yeah, I think that's kind of about it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. As always, links down below to all the socials and the Discord and everything. If you want to come talk about the deck a little bit more, if you enjoy it, feel free to leave a like, maybe even consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. It doesn't cost you anything. Yeah, if you got questions, leave them down below. I always love to hear feedback from people. If you agree or disagree with anything said in the video, if you have some experience that's been working out well for you, love to hear it so we can pass it along to other players in other videos. Other than that, I'll be doing more videos for this, more videos like this as the week goes on. Planning on doing one, obviously this one for Boros. Gonna do one for the Eldrazi matchup, the Grinding Station matchup, probably Belcher, maybe Amulet Titan, definitely the Orzhov Blink deck, and maybe the Mirror. Kind of expecting the Mirror to take a pretty big hit after the Prague and Ottawa results, but I really hope that videos like this encourage you to believe that these matchups are not hopeless, that you have a good chance. You just need to be prepared and ready to make the decisions necessary to get you across the finish line. I think the most common cause of trip ups from matches that I've seen has been not going into the matchup with a defined plan, what you're looking for, what you're not looking for, what you're trying to accomplish, and utilizing your spells in a way that works towards that goal instead of just kind of firing things at the hip, like firing off a spell snare on something because you can fire off a spell snare on something, instead of firing off a spell snare because preventing this thing from being on the board is how you get closer to winning the way you've set out you can. So yeah, if you have questions, as always, leave them in the comments. Love reading them, love getting feedback, love dropping opinions here and there and helping out whoever I can help out. So that'll wrap up this one. I hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your day, morning, afternoon, evening. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company, and I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.